The Great Ecclesiastical Conspiracy, Chapter 2, continued. The expression to oversee does not imply office in the sense of one being superior to another. It is a job description, not an office title. It describes those who have the God-given ability to see the needs of others and to tend to those needs. They are caregivers, not overlords. The literal Greek stresses a good work of serving the community of Christ, not an illustrious office called bishop. Please note this difference. The latter is spawned out of the desire to be first. The former is motivated by love. Which do you think was the meaning of the author who laid his life down in service and in martyrdom for Christ's sake and the sake of his body, the ecclesia? If Paul had sought to promote an office and himself as an officer, early church history would have been much different. The truth is that he loved not his life unto death, and thought little about his own promotion. He had a job to finish, a course to run, and his thoughts were preoccupied with its faithful completion. History bears this out. The meaning of the Greek word episkopos in a Christian context is watch over, not as a superintendent, but as a caregiver. Episkopos does not refer to an authoritarian position within the church, but is a description of the function of those who have advanced in maturity, both naturally and spiritually. That maturity is manifest in their selfless and godly care for all believers. We should listen to such individuals, but this does not mean they are our lords, and we are to render them unquestioned obedience. Such men and women are not distinguished by titles and robes, but by their loving devotion and service to Christ and his body. Where then did we get the concept that bishops are rulers? Perhaps a lesson in history would help the modern reader to better understand how it is that we inherited the current hierarchical system of church leadership. From the first century until now, the political mindset of each era of history was adopted by the church in that particular area. Hence, the concept of ruling bishops evolved, with each generation and nation adding its own peculiar twist. When the church falls to the level of a mere institution, it will always adopt the political style of the nation where it resides. Generally speaking, the bent of the natural man was to make the word bishop a title of a ruling position instead of the function of a caregiver and servant, such as the godly elderly of the early church. It was somewhat due to the influence of Ignatius in the 2nd century that this concept arose. It was Ignatius who held the concept that the bishop, overseer, was a different person from the elder, which means an older, wiser one. Ignatius was received well because of his affiliation with the Lord's aged disciple John. He overemphasized obedience to bishops and stressed the unbiblical clergy-laity distinction which was already spreading throughout the world. Eventually, the concept of a head bishop over the other bishops in each city began to evolve, which developed further into a mother church concept in that a bigger city held reign over its smaller surrounding cities and villages. This eventually led to the invention of such grandiose titles as archbishop, cardinal, and pope. None of these titles are found in the scriptures or in the writings of the early church fathers. After this, the local character of the ecclesia was lost, because there was now one worldwide hierarchy with the pope at the top. The concept of one Catholic, meaning universal church, was brought into full swing, divided into administrative districts known as dioceses, another concept that was borrowed from the Roman government. Then there was the European influence. The prevailing political and economic system of Europe was the feudal system. The lands were all owned by either the kings or his lords. The common man was permitted to live on that land that surrounded the castle of each lord, and the peasants were taxed on what they produced as well as paying rent to the lord. In exchange, the serfs could run to the shelter of the castle and its moat if there was an invasion of the land by another army, or they could turn to the Jarafa, or Sir Jarafa, sheriff, who also doubled as tax collector, to keep the thieves at bay and maintain order. The Roman model of the church coattailed on this system. The bishop or archbishop reigned from a cathedral. These were very political positions, often occupied by members of the ruling class. The right of primogeniture was part and parcel of the feudal system. The king and his lords gave the entire inheritance to the oldest son. As a result, the younger sons, disgruntled and rejected, often sought power and identity by gaining office in the church. These two systems worked hand in hand to maintain control over the serfs. One used the threat of an army and sheriffs, the other threatened the heavenly displeasure of God himself. The very possibility of being branded a heretic and having to face the torment of the church's inquisitors and their various methods of torture often kept would-be dissenters at bay. After all, the church could always depend on the armies of the kings to back it up in time of need, just as Herod and Pontius Pilate came to the aid of the Jewish Sanhedrin when it came time to crucify Jesus. It is interesting to note that the cathedrals had a second desired effect besides giving the bishop and his servants a place to reign from. These structures were an engineering feat and very intimidating. Compared to the thatch roof mud huts of the common serf, These giant structures that dominated the skyline were like putting a man on the moon in terms of the technology of the day. The common man was humbled by the very structure itself, and was prone to think that the one who was the pilot of such a building as this must be like unto God himself. The American church is an amalgamation of all of the above influences, and adds its own unique cultural bias to the mix. Hence, the American church is run like a corporation, and its leadership is modeled after the entrepreneurial CEO. None of these influences can be found in the Lord's teachings or the example of the early church. The presence of such societal values in the church indicates that the world has been more influential in shaping the church and its leadership than has the spirit of the lowly Christ, who said, "My kingdom is not of this world." The word bishopric. Now let us consider another old ecclesiastical word that has been used to advance this notion of office. Bishopric is a strange sounding word that appears only once in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 1 verse 20. For it is written in the book of Psalms, "Let his habitation be desolate, and let no man dwell therein, and his bishopric, episkopes, let another take." One of the definitions of episkopes is visitation, which we feel comes closest to capturing its true meaning. Visitation speaks of a work, not an office. Nevertheless, the term bishopric sure sounds official. It is important to note here that the word visitation throughout the Old Testament primarily applies to the judgment of God upon the nations. Even Jerusalem, the city of peace, would know such judgment. Standing on a hill overlooking his beloved city, Jesus wept as he spoke the following words: "If you, even you, had known today the things which belong to your peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come on you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you, surround you, hem you in on every side, and will dash you and your children within you to the ground. They will not leave in you one stone on another, because you didn't know the time of your visitation." Episcope. Luke 19:42-44, WB. Jesus selected the apostles for this specific purpose. Just as he stood before the high council as a divine testimony against them, so these men he selected stood before the governors and kings of the nations for a testimony against them. "And ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles." Matthew 10:18. They were to attest to a new kingdom with a new king. This could explain why they were not long upon this earth. They were as ill-treated as their Savior was. They were not called to execute judgment upon the ecclesia, but to lift the standard of the gospel of the kingdom before all, including governors and kings. They filled up the measure of Jesus' sufferings. It was a thankless job, rewarded by stripes and imprisonment and finally death. They had been called to suffering. The Lord spoke to Ananias regarding this call on Paul's life, saying, "For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." Acts 9:16, NKJV. Paul commented on this further in 1 Corinthians 4:9, saying, "For I think that God has displayed us, the apostles, last, as men condemned to death, for we have been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men." Jesus spoke about this to Peter in John chapter 21. "Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger you girded yourself and walked where you wished, but when you are old you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." John 21:18 and 19. They knew the fellowship of his sufferings. They drank deeply from his cup. Let everyone who aspires to be an apostle fully understand the job description. It is not an opportunity to be first and rule over God's saints, but to glorify him in being set forth as last, appointed to death, as the filth of the world and the offscouring of all things, as a testimony and a witness. Do you still want the job?